During a strong storm, a cruise ship with over 1,000 people on board loses power. The engines stop working and a big wave breaks the windows, letting freezing water pour in. The Viking Sky is close to sinking as it moves toward dangerous rocks near the shore. The captain sends out a mayday call for help, and experts get ready for a disaster like the Titanic. This is a story of a big mistake. The story of how the Viking Sky almost had a terrible accident. On March the 23rd, 2019, the Viking Sky was sailing through Hustadvika Bay when its engine suddenly stopped. The ship had already been fighting huge 6-meter waves for hours, and now, in the worst part of the storm, it couldn't move. The crew quickly tried to start the engines again as the ship rocked side to side, but with strong winds blowing at 90 miles per hour, the danger got even worse. This fancy ship should not have been so close to trouble. As we will learn, the problem started years before. The Viking Sky is one of 6 cruise ships owned by Viking Ocean Cruises. It specializes in luxury holidays, where guests can enjoy scenic views of the Arctic Circle and catch glimpses of the Northern Lights. But, as an entertainment company, Viking Ocean Cruises doesn't have the naval expertise to maintain the fleet. Instead, once ships are built by Italian firm Fincantieri, its seafaring activities are handled by Wilhelmsen, a maritime service provider based in Norway. The Viking Sky is still considered a state-of-the-art cruise liner today, so when it launched in 2017, you'd think it had all its documentation in place. But conflicting reports suggest this wasn't the case. In 2016, Wilhelmsen engineers working on a sister vessel realized they lacked crucial information to maintain the fleet. Its engine manufacturer hadn't provided guidelines for the correct oil and alarm levels of its sump tanks. It seems a strange oversight for a $400 million ocean cruiser, but it's more baffling as the ship's diesel engines also generate its electricity. So if they failed mid-voyage, the Viking Sky would be left without power and propulsion. So for several years, the fleet carried thousands of passengers on ships its engineers weren't even sure how to maintain. If this isn't troubling enough, the ship could carry 930 guests and 465 crew members. Despite those numbers, it was classified as a small ship. Think of how many crew are on board, then think of how many passengers, and then go and have a look and count the lifeboats. Remember the Titanic, chums? Wasn't enough lifeboats, was there? There's not enough lifeboats on the cruise ships today. Unaware of these risks, the ship's largely retired passengers were excited to begin their 12-day cruise along the Norwegian coast. Beginning in Bergen, the route took passengers north to several towns, ending in a visit to Bodø. From there, they'd head south and navigate a notorious stretch of sea in the Hustadvika Bay area. The region is infamous for its shallow reefs, rough seas, and sudden weather changes, so sailors are on high alert to navigate safely while feeling the pressure to meet tight schedules. The first week of the cruise went as expected, and on March 21st guests were enjoying a visit to Tromsø. But this is where the voyage ran into several issues. Severe weather was predicted over the next few days, and rival companies canceled their planned trips. But the bad weather wasn't the only problem. One of the ship's diesel-electric generators, called DG3, wasn't working because its turbocharger was broken. Usually, this wasn't a big deal for the cruise company, but the ship would be delayed if it stayed in Tromsø waiting for spare parts. There was also a shortage of required staff, specifically trained pilots who guide ships through tricky waters. 2 expert pilots were needed for the hardest part of the journey, but one of the pilots on board was only allowed to sail as far as Kristiansund. The second pilot was scheduled to join the ship after the most dangerous part, Hustadvika Bay. Still, the captain and pilots believed they could get through the bay safely. They also had a technician who could fix the broken generator once they got to Stavanger. Even knowing the risks, they decided to leave the port of Tromsø late at night. But this choice went against maritime safety rules. With one generator not working, the ship wouldn't have enough backup power if other engines failed at sea. And soon, passengers would find out that these weren't the only problems on board the Viking Sky. Roughly 3 hours after leaving Tromsø, an alarm alerted the crew that DG2 had low lubricating oil, but it stopped shortly afterward, so no further action was taken by technicians. The weather at this point of the journey was fine, and as the day progressed, crew on the bridge closely monitored increasing wind speeds. By morning, however, the captain was worried about reaching their next destination. Conditions were expected to decline in the evening, which could result in the ship being trapped when it made port. So, after assessing the situation, he decided to cancel a planned trip to Bodø. Disappointed, he told the passengers the area was too dangerous to sail. Instead, the Viking Sky set course to Stavanger. Several hours later, crew were instructed to prepare the ship for deteriorating weather and secure loose items in the hull. But as the ship continued sailing in mellow waters inshore, the wind and waves became increasingly restless throughout the day. By midnight, the strong breeze had grown into gale-force winds, and the ship's logbook recorded 6-meter waves. It forced the captain to halve the ship's speed to ensure a more comfortable ride for passengers. But if they thought their night's sleep was rough, passengers had no idea what lay in store come daybreak. In the early hours of the following day, multiple warnings registered on the ship. The first was another alarm indicating low lubricating oil. Only this time, it was for DG4's sump tank. And as the Viking Sky entered Trondheim, winds increased to a severe gale. Despite being sheltered from the full effects of the volatile tide by a series of islands, more alarms sounded as they crossed the Trondheim fairway. This included a second low oil level warning for DG4, and the forecast predicted that the already intense winds would only grow stronger. So the captain ordered a heavy weather checklist to be carried out to prepare for the onslaught. While this happened, over 150 warnings triggered for various systems, including additional low oil alerts for DG4. By this point, the engineer on watch had acknowledged 3 separate warnings for DG4, but each was cleared from the system without adding oil or investigating further. Meanwhile, passengers were having breakfast like normal. But many started to feel nervous as the storm began to show its strength. Some people had trouble standing up. Others saw glasses breaking and things sliding around on the tables in the restaurant. Later in the morning, engineers checked the oil tanks, tested the alarms by hand, and noted the oil levels. Everything seemed normal at the time. But that mistake would lead to serious problems just a few hours later. Sorry for the interruption. Before we continue with the story, I kindly ask you to like the video and subscribe to this channel. It is very important for us. Thank you very much. As midday came closer, the ship entered Hustadvika Bay, and one of the pilots left the control room as planned. Now, back in open sea, the Viking Sky was hit by 7-meter waves, and the captain warned passengers that a storm was on its way. Less than an hour later, the storm was officially declared a violent one. Doors and windows flew open and slammed shut as strong winds blew over 90 miles per hour. Just after 1:11 p.m., the crew said they had finished the checklist for bad weather. One of the tasks was adding more oil to the sump tanks, but even though they marked it as done, the tanks hadn't actually been filled yet. Due to their negligence, engines had been running low on oil for over 24 hours, and as the ship pitched and rolled in the sea, air was sucked into the lubricating system pipes. This further reduced the engine's oil supply and dramatically increased their load. But unknown to everyone, a fatal design doomed the voyage from the moment it left Tromsø. On top of being underfilled, the sump tanks were around 40% smaller than regulations required. This was the final straw for the ship's strained engines, as they had reached their breaking point. In the engine control room, several alarms went off at once. DG4 oil had dipped below the minimum level, triggering an automatic mechanism to prevent a blowout. Both DG1 and DG4 started losing electrical power, which was followed by a low oil alert for DG1. The situation was critical, yet the warnings were ignored, and the engineer on watch simply cleared them from the system. Many floors above, on the ship's bridge, the captain and pilot relaxed, unconcerned with the chaos brewing below. So when DG4 and DG2 shut down in quick succession, it came as a complete shock. Both were caused by low lube oil pressure, and a flurry of alarms sounded at once. The engineer on watch immediately contacted the chief engineer, who quickly headed to the control room. With limited speed, the Viking Sky stabilizers automatically retracted, causing the ship to roll almost double the 6-degree angle it was before. Since those in charge weren't on top of the emerging crisis, passengers and staff were left in a vulnerable position. They were still serving lunch and moving about common areas while technicians tried to get DG2 back online. Approximately 10 minutes later, DG2 was restarted by the crew, and the ship stabilizers were brought online. But this was only a temporary respite. DG2 shut down again, quickly followed by DG1, causing a total blackout. The ship had no power or steering as it was hit by huge waves and strong winds. It was stuck and couldn't move, completely dead in the water. Passengers started to panic, not knowing what was going on. In the dim light, they gathered together under flickering lamps while the captain tried to understand the situation. A crew member later said, "Everything was broken: plates, glasses, furniture." In the control room, the crew had trouble dealing with the alarm system, which wasn't well designed. Up to 1,000 alarms went off at once, many of them for small problems. This made it hard for the engineers to figure out what the real issue was. So, when the captain asked them how long it would take to fix the power, they didn't know. He saw that the ship was drifting closer to the coast. He quickly sent out a distress call. "Mayday, mayday, mayday, this is Viking Sky. Engines failed in storm conditions. 100 meters from rocks. Request immediate assistance." It was picked up by the Norwegian Coast Guard, who sprung into action, quickly launching boats to aid the ship. With help on the way, the captain tried to stop the ship. Both anchors were dropped, crashing to the seabed with an unnervingly rapid thud. But they couldn't hold in the massive swell, and the Viking Sky continued drifting, damaging the anchors as they dragged along the seafloor. While the guests feared for their lives, the crew fought desperately to get the engines back online. They finally realized low oil pressure was the problem and started transferring oil into the sump tanks. But poor training meant they hadn't practiced restoring power without a backup generator, so steps to reset the engines weren't completed in the correct order. At this point, one of the pilots took over communicating with rescuers, and the captain prepared the ship for evacuation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the general emergency signal. For all crew, please get to emergency positions. And for all guests, please proceed to your muster stations at this time, either muster station A or B." To their credit, passengers remained as calm as possible. And then, some good news came from the engineers. They managed to reset DG2 and restore limited power to the vessel, meaning there was a fighting chance of firing up the propeller motors. However, not long after, the Viking Sky drifted over a rock with only 4 meters of clearance to the ship. Experts later warned it was only minutes from running aground, becoming one of the worst maritime disaster stories in modern times. Half an hour later, passengers were anticipating their rescue when a massive wave hit the ship near the second muster point. It smashed through windows and ripped a heavy metal door off its hinges, causing ice-cold water to flood through the ship. Some were injured by shards of glass and other loose objects, with the most serious injuries including a broken neck when the door struck passengers. If help didn't come soon, there was a serious danger that many people could die from the cold in the rough sea. One passenger described what happened. "I slid across the floor, and when the ship rolled back, I slid the other way and ended up under a table. The table trapped my leg, and I was in water up to my neck." The Coast Guard saw how urgent the situation was, but they couldn't attach ropes to pull the ship because it was leaning up to 30 degrees. With no other choice, they returned to shore and sent 6 helicopters to rescue the passengers. The helicopters arrived just after water got into the ship's hull and started saving the most injured and weakest guests first. The rescue moved slowly because of the bad weather. To save time, they lifted people 2 at a time into the helicopters. Throughout the next hour, DG-1 and DG-2 were brought back online. This at last gave Viking Sky a slim chance to avoid the shallows, albeit at a modest speed. And not long after, a Coast Guard vessel and heavy tugboat Vivax reached the ship. To the relief of all on board, they helped the captain navigate away from the reef. Even so, the ship struggled to get clear of danger entirely, and Vivax couldn't tow Viking Sky to safety. So another tugboat was drafted to help, but it would take some time to reach the area. As the ship crawled into deeper waters, DG-2 briefly shut down due to low oil pressure, which was quickly resolved by engineers. It now had all 3 generators working and was in a place of relative safety. The evacuation continued through the night. By the early hours of March the 24th, the tugboat Ocean Response arrived at the scene. Roughly 1,100 people were still stranded. Even with rescuers working non-stop, cold and wet, they'd been trapped for nearly 13 hours, waiting for daylight and an end to this ordeal. Mercifully, when the sun rose, the storm was beginning to ease, and tow lines from both tugboats were attached to Viking Sky. The crew were also able to stabilize the vessel thanks to the calmer seas, and the rescue operation stopped not long after. In a monumental effort, 460 people had been evacuated from the ship. The starboard anchor, so damaged it couldn't be winched back into place, was cut free, and the Viking Sky limped ashore, aiming to dock in Mold. It arrived in the late afternoon, and the remaining passengers and full complement of crew thanked God they'd survived. To his credit, the chairman of Viking Ocean Cruises apologized to passengers in person, and they were given a full refund for their holiday. It could have been a very bad situation, and I think we are very grateful for the captain. In the aftermath of the voyage, Viking Ocean Cruises reported major damage to the ship's starboard side and windows. Some were destroyed outright. There was also stress on the ship's structure and superficial damage throughout. The investigation found that design problems and low oil levels were the main reasons for the accident. It made more than 14 suggestions, like redesigning the tanks and making changes to keep the ship safe at sea. Wilhelmsen and Viking Ocean Cruises were also blamed for their role in what happened, especially for deciding to leave the port in Tromsø, not training staff well for a power outage, and not making sure that 2 certified pilots were on board for the whole trip. Both companies improved their training programs and added new rules to better handle alarms and warnings. They also changed company policies to follow all safety rules for ships and pilot staffing. 18 people were hurt, but only 1 had serious injuries. Even with this accident, cruising is still one of the safest ways to travel, and it's amazing that no one died. Did you enjoy this story? Have you ever faced an emergency while traveling? Maybe during a storm or out at sea? Share your experience in the comments below. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give it a thumbs up. The Viking Sky incident reminds us that it's always wise to stay prepared and alert. Danger can strike when you least expect it. Thanks so much for listening. See you in the next video, and have a wonderful day.